Dr. Siegel gave a nice segue into this talk. As he has already alluded to, I have an interest in clinical trials and focusing on taking what's been discovered in the laboratory to human beings for some new MS treatments. So I'm going to spend some time talking about some of that today. What I'd like to do first is talk a little bit about sort of where we were before a few years ago and kind of where we are now and where we're going, and a little bit about just a brief timeline in the history of MS treatments so you can kind of see how things have been evolving over the last few years. And I hope that this will convince you that this is actually a promising time for MS treatments. I also am going to spend a little bit of time talking about clinical trials and reviewing those concepts and exactly what a clinical trial is, and to try to hopefully drive home how important clinical trials are in terms of evaluating drugs and ultimately finding and discovering the best treatments for MS patients. I think a lot of times people hear about clinical trials and they don't really understand necessarily what that process is, so I'm hoping I can shed some light on that for you today. Then I'm going to talk about a couple of recently approved MS treatments, two treatments in particular, fingolimod or Gilenya, which is a new disease-modifying therapy, and also a medication for symptoms called Ampura. And then I'm going to talk about a few new treatments that are in the pipeline and on the horizon, currently being tested in clinical trials, but treatments that we think are most likely to be approved soon. There's a lot of treatments out there, and I'm going to keep this talk relatively focused, but I would encourage you in terms of other treatments, if you have questions about other treatments that weren't mentioned in the talk, certainly those questions could be submitted in writing on the index cards. So this is just to give you kind of a sense of where things were and where things are going. I wish I could have made this timeline longer. If I had about 3 more screens to take you back into even the 1960s, you could see that things were relatively sparse in terms of things that we had to offer our MS patients in the past. If you look at the slide here, before or even in the 1980s and pre-1980s, we really only had a few treatments. Steroids were used to treat patients with MS, and there was another medication called ACTH, or adrenocorticotropin hormone. Some of you who have had MS for many years may recognize this as a treatment that helps your body stimulate its own steroid production. And a few chemotherapies, including Cytoxan, but really that was the extent of the MS treatments back before 1980. And it wasn't until the 1990s when we started to see therapies that were more specifically targeted for multiple sclerosis. Beta-seron came out in 1993. That was the first of the drugs, one of the interferons, as many of you may know. And then eventually, Avonex, Rebif, and Copaxone all came out sort of in rapid succession between 1993 to 2001. And since that time, we've seen even more promising treatments become available. Tysabri, and there were a few other chemotherapies here. One's called Novantrone. But as you can see, that really it's been a boom since the early 1990s, and it's going to continue to grow because there are many, many new treatments coming down the pipeline. So every one of these red arrows here along this timeline are things that have already been approved by the FDA. But this blue arrow just reflects all of the other medications that are currently being evaluated right now for multiple sclerosis. So as you can see, it's actually quite reassuring to see that so many new medications are being tested and evaluated at this point. But what else has changed? Well, Dr. Siegel kind of alluded to this as well, that the timeliness of the diagnosis is improving with the advent of MRI, but also the effectiveness of treatment. So in addition to having more options for our patients, the new treatments that are being evaluated are much more effective. More powerful and efficient methods of evaluating these drugs is also very important, and doing our best to get these drugs evaluated on a timely basis so that they can be available for patients if they turn out to be effective. And this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of clinical trials. So what is a clinical trial? Well, a clinical trial is a study or an experiment that compares the effect of an intervention. So this intervention can be a new medication, a new method of performing a procedure, a new medical device, but ultimately something new that is hopefully going to be used in patients, and testing it against some sort of a control or a comparator, something where a new medication, if you're going to test it, you want to test it against something that's already available, such as a medication that's already out on the market, or in some cases a placebo, but you're comparing it to another substance And what you're doing is you're testing its effectiveness in a particular disease. And this is a study of humans. Clinical trials do not involve animals. When we talk about clinical trials, we're talking about human studies. This is the preferred method for the evaluation of medical treatments and procedures. And even though this may seem somewhat obvious, it hasn't been until the last few decades that this has been more the standard way of doctors applying their medical knowledge and using treatments in patients. It wasn't that long ago when doctors would primarily rely on their own experience or even recommendations from mentors and things like that to decide which treatments were most appropriate for their patients. But with clinical trials, we have much better and much more objective evidence that medications do work in patients and just how effective they can be. It also helps to evaluate drug safety. And so this is very important as well when you're trying to make decisions about the risks and benefits of a treatment. And this will give you the best method for evaluating whether or not a drug is appropriate for each patient. This is the purpose of this is to maximize safety and also to eliminate biases that all of us humans have when we're evaluating medications. And so clinical trials are done in the most objective measure possible. So you probably, when you're reading about MS medications, a lot of times you'll see reports that say a phase 2 trial showed this or a phase 3 trial showed this. And what does that exactly mean? Well, clinical trials are broken up into phases, actually. This is something, it's a very systematic process, so it goes through a very, very well-planned out scheme for a drug to make it from the laboratory bench to the patient. We have what we call the preclinical phase, and this is actually the phase when you're evaluating a drug at the laboratory bench. And so this means testing the drug on a line of cells or in animals to see if the drug has any benefit. But ultimately, this has to be moved on to the humans to test it in humans. I'm sorry. So the first step of this is what we call the phase 1 clinical trial. And the phase 1 trial is actually just the first step in human research. And what this means is that this medication is now being taken to human beings, but it's primarily for the purposes of focusing on safety, to make sure that this drug is safe for patients. And this is the one time when a lot of times the drug is actually tested on healthy people first, people who don't have the disease. And so this is really just the first step. It's usually only done in a very small number of people to find out if it's safe and also to find out what the safest dose is. If the drug passes the phase 1 clinical trials and ultimately it looks like it's a safe drug that can be, and we find a well-tolerated dose, then the drug will go on to be studied in what we call phase 2 clinical trials. And this is usually a bigger number of people, usually within 1 to 200 people. And this is the first study now. This is the first step in deciding, is this particular drug active for the disease that we're using it for? So at this point, we're using patients. We're using people with the disease that we're studying as opposed to healthy people. And this is usually what we call a proof of concept study, which means we want to see if this drug is working in the disease that we're studying it in. Even if we are successful, however, in the phase 2 studies look good and it looks like the drug is effective in patients who have the disease, there is one more step. It's called the phase 3 study. And this is a larger study. It's more confirmatory to make sure that what we saw in the phase 2 study is actually true. But we look at the efficacy of the drug in a larger group of patients at this point, usually anywhere, even as many as 1,000 to 2,000 people. The purpose of the phase 3 study is not only to confirm that the drug works, but also to gather more safety data. In larger groups of people, you can see more safety outcomes. And so it's really important to make sure that you're applying this to a larger number of patients to make sure that this drug is safe. And oftentimes this, even though in previous years this has often been tested against a placebo or an inactive drug or an inactive substance, we're moving to an era now where the new drugs that we're studying are being tested against something that's already out there on the market, a standard of care. So we're much more in favor of this because we do feel for ethical reasons that patients who are enrolled in a clinical trial should be receiving some sort of treatment. And also it helps to know, head to head, how does the new drug stack up against the medications that are already out there on the market. So usually this is the last step prior to a drug receiving FDA approval, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But Just to give you a sense of how things move, and when you hear these phases, this is what this means. There is also, there are also phase 4 studies. Oftentimes after a drug becomes approved, it's still being studied, even after it's been approved by the FDA. And companies will continue to gather long-term safety data and efficacy data on the drugs. They may even think about using it for other indications. But really the phase 2 and the phase 3 studies are the ones that I'm going to focus on, which is why they're highlighted here. So this is just kind of a neat depiction of, it's a timeline showing you exactly just what happens and how a compound makes it from the bench to the bedside. And so this is your timeline down here and how long each one of these steps takes. So for every one drug that gets approved by the FDA, anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 compounds are studied. So this is not for the weak-hearted. This is a very competitive area. But what we see is that for every it takes about 3 to 6 years to study these compounds initially at the bench or in the laboratory. But eventually, some of those drugs will look promising, at least in preclinical studies. And if they're fortunate enough to look promising in the preclinical studies, they go on to the phase 1 clinical trials like we talked about, so maybe checking it and testing the safety in about 10 or 20 subjects, usually healthy people. And then ultimately, if it passes muster, it moves on to phase 2 and phase 3. And then eventually, if things continue to look very promising, FDA approval. And on average, the process takes about 12 years. But this just gives you a sense of where things go. And then, again, more phase 4 studies to keep monitoring patients for safety. So on to some of these medications. So fingolimod, I'm sure many of you have either read about fingolimod or have already been talking about it with your doctors. The brand name for this medication is called Gilenya. This is the first FDA-approved oral treatment for multiple sclerosis. It was approved, it's been almost a year already since it's been out on the market. It was approved September 21st of last year. It is indicated for relapsing remitting MS, FDA approved for relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. And this drug works in kind of a unique way. It actually traps some of the immune cells that are implicated in multiple sclerosis. It traps them in the lymph nodes so that they can't escape into the bloodstream and get into your nervous system to cause damage. So it's a unique mechanism, and it's fairly convenient dosing. It's 1 capsule taken daily. There's only 1 dose. It's 0.5 milligrams per day. Another dose was studied in the clinical trials, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, but ultimately it was found that there was no extra benefit in using the higher dose, and so for safety reasons, only the lower dose has been approved.